The International Court of Justice, a UN body often called the World Court, today issued a ruling on a question posed to it 2 years ago. In its advisory opinion to the UN General Assembly, it noted that Israel's settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and historically in the Gaza Strip, are unlawful. It also argued that the discriminatory laws and policies affecting Palestinians in all three areas amount to racial segregation and apartheid. The opinion is wide-ranging. It addressed home demolitions, de facto annexations and seizures of Palestinian property, the exploitation of natural resources, systemic violence by settlers and IDF against Palestinians, and checkpoints and other restrictions on movement, and many other aspects of the matrix of occupation. Together, these comprise a historic vindication of what the Palestinians have been crying out to the world to notice for a long, long time. The report they issued should be read and distributed widely because it presents a case that those of us in the scholarly and activist communities have been making for decades, but in the dispassionate legalese instead of an international body that has all the authority a court can offer. And it will be important in order to combat Zionist rhetoric on this. I've already seen and read several Israeli newspaper pieces on it, and they are not honest. The Jerusalem Post, for example, ran a story in which they quote they placed occupation in scare quotes. And they noted the non-binding nature of the ruling and completely ignored half of the document by making no mention at all of the court's criticism of apartheid laws in the territories. This is typical, as much of the Israeli media systematically lies to the population there, just as the government does. And many Israelis honestly have no idea what it is like in the occupied territories. They are strongly discouraged and sometimes prohibited from entering them, and the stories they're told about life there are straight up fictional. If you've wondered why so many Zionists can pop up and say, that life here is so good and Palestinians have rights and everything else, well, it's because that's kind of what their government and media are telling them. And we need to counter that somehow. Now, in general, ICJ rulings are binding, but are unenforceable. That's one of the flaws of the court structure, as it depends largely on Security Council actions for enforcement. In most cases, countries will take these seriously, such that UNSC sanctions would not be needed. This case is different, as this is what we call an advisory ruling. This is a legal opinion presented to another UN body, in this case the General Assembly, upon request. This means the ruling is not binding and will not constrain Israel in any way. And Israel has a long history of ignoring such rulings. 2004 ICJ opinion declared the apartheid wall that was built on in the West Bank on stolen land to be illegal, and also ruled similarly against the settlements, but that opinion was dismissed. The wall is still up, and settlement construction continues to the present. In fact, during the current conflict, an unprecedented number of new housing units have been approved in the West Bank, and hundreds have been murdered there by settlers keen to terrorize the population and ensure permanent colonial control. But a court opinion like this does still matter, and here's why. World opinion has been shifting against Israel for some time now. It used to be only in the former colonized world that there was any sympathy for Palestinians, and we all know, I hope, that when the US or Europe talk about the global community, they largely mean the former colonial powers and their successful settler colonies. Ignoring the opinions of African and Asian and Latin American countries is business as usual. But these days, increasing numbers of countries in the richer world, as well as their populations, are taking positions opposed to Israel's actions and in favor of Palestinian dignity and rights. About half of Americans now express sympathy for the Palestinians and think they deserve equal protection under international law. This is a titanic shift, and a ruling like this, when properly publicized, these do play a part in that. Now, we have a long way to go, especially in a handful of very powerful countries. The United Kingdom and Australia, for example, both urged the World Court to defy its mandate and not issue an advisory ruling at all, since those powers well know what is happening and are complicit in the terrorization of Palestinians. The United States didn't go quite as far and simply asked the court to limit the scope of its ruling, which, fortunately, it did not do. These governments and others like Germany have acted for decades to support Israeli apartheid and to justify the statelessness and inhumane treatment of Palestinians. This must end. And the way to do that is clear. We need to mobilize public opinion and win the argument there. As much as Western governments actually hate listening to the people, there are many ways in which they can be forced to do so. The better we get at informing the public about the horrific conditions of life under Israeli occupation, the more easily we can draw people into the streets and build support for divestment and sanctions. At this point, the only things the Israelis will listen to are force and economic consequences, and force is both impossible and undesirable. But if we can get a clear majority in favor of cutting off aid and leveling sanctions, we can force the Israeli public to turn on its own government and change the situation. The world has tried wagging its finger at Jerusalem to no avail. It is time to hurt them in the pocketbook and make the public there scream for a just solution. The occupation of Palestine continues only because we help it to continue. Israel cannot afford to maintain the status quo on its own, and they know it. This is why Zionists work so hard to lie to Western audiences. Stop arguing with them. Don't argue with Zionists and work instead to sway the vast majority of the general public about the need for dignity, security, and basic justice for the Palestinians who have endured brutal military rule since 1967. We can do this, and we need to do this.